A session here about GitHub commits. Is that right?
That's right.
How did you get the idea to analyze that data set?
Personal itch to scratch. So I'm a big open source fan. I spend a lot of time on GitHub. I'm a big fan of GitHub in general. And the problem that I had was I actually follow about 3,000 open source projects. And I try to just keep up with what's going on, what are people contributing to, what are the new interesting sub-branches of work being done, or maybe there's a new project being open sourced. And the problem I ran into about 6 months ago was that, frankly, it was just too much to keep up, right? So the GitHub timeline was actually overflowing, as in I would have to, in order to keep up, I would need to go in and every 4 hours, scan through everything, and then you have to repeat it. So that doesn't give you much time for sleep either, right,
Sure.
in between. So my first idea was like, well, I could just aggregate that data and archive it, and that would be useful. But then I realized that, given the number of projects I already follow, I wasn't actually just interested in those 3,000 projects. I was interested in the global questions, like what are the interesting projects being open sourced on GitHub, or what are the most active projects in JavaScript, or related to Ruby, or some other sub-branch, or some other programming language. And that's where the idea was born. It was like, well, if I had access to the entire activity data, that's, I could actually do that analysis. And that's, I connected with the GitHub guys, and they were kind enough to offer that data. They actually had a public endpoint, but I just want to make sure that, I could archive it and make it public. And so we did. So I built a simple crawler that would just archive all of this data. It would upload it in kind of a daily, not even daily, hourly archives, such that anybody could then download it and go back and say, well, I want to see activity for April 23rd, 2012, because whatever question, right?
Sure.
And then you could ask interesting and intelligent questions about that data and query it, which is very much the theme of big data, right? It's like, it's not the questions that you have in mind right now, it's the questions that you can ask of the data.
Was there a core question that you wanted to ask? I mean, you discussed, sort of keeping up with it, and you mentioned
Sure.
a couple questions, but was there something that was just kind of like a splinter in your brain?
Yeah, so, I was trying to solve my own itch, right? And that's how a lot of open source starts, I guess, right?
Sure.
So for me, it was a specific question of, in the last 24 hours, really what I wanted to know is which are the new open source projects that came online or became public, and which ones got attention? Because there's a lot of projects that get open source that don't go anywhere, unfortunately. So that was the first question. So how do you answer that? And the second one was, out of the projects that have already existed, was there any unusual bursts of activity? And unusual is a very interesting definition in itself. Maybe it's the number of people starting the project. Maybe a lot of issues got closed, which tells you something.
Sure.
Or maybe a bunch of pull requests were open. So to answer those questions, I actually created a daily newsletter for me. So it's just an email that I get every day that says, here are the projects that were open source, here are the projects that were created previously but got a lot of attention. And it is actually a public mailing list. So we have about 400 people subscribing to it now.
Right?
Just getting this daily email. And at the end of the day, once we had the data, the actual logistics or the code to make that work was like 40 lines of Ruby code, right? Just like get the data out of BigQuery, push it into an HTML template, and publish it with MailChimp. It was beautiful.
Right.
So I solved my problem, but I think what is most exciting about this project is because we made that data publicly available to others, it's the questions that other people started asking, right? It's the kind of stuff that I would never think. Like the first thing, literally, we announced the project, and then next day, we had a website called Commits from Last Night, which is, as you can infer from the name, right? It's the kind of stuff that you don't want other people to probably see.
Oh God, that's
but you can
funny.
just see people, their levels of frustration and everything. So that was fun. But then we also had deeper analysis into things like, which are the languages, which are the programming languages that create joy, right? Like if you're in commit message, you're saying this is awesome or like whatever, right? Versus anger, versus something else. And you see very distinct patterns. Like for example, we shared some data earlier today with Brian. If your language has a C as part of the name, so C, C++, C#, Objective-C, it's anger-inducing. Much more so than any other language. Surprise, which languages generate surprise? Perl.
Really?
Which shouldn't be surprising to a lot of people. If you've ever worked with Perl, it's like, really?
Yeah, right.
You look at that query or that expression.
Yeah.
So it's those kinds of questions. And on top of that, we also now have actual research. So people in the academia looking at these data sets, asking questions like, so what is actually a DNA or a DNA of a successful open source project. What does that even mean, right? Like, what are the interesting questions to ask there? So are there specific patterns that specific projects follow that create great open source projects?
Right.
So it's very interesting to just observe how people are using this data.
I
And
bet.
that, if anything, that is the most exciting part.
That's really interesting. Now, have you noticed that the availability of a data set like that seems to tap into a built-up demand for questions? Where presumably, people had kind of had thoughts about these things before.
Yep.
Now suddenly they're empowered to ask those questions.
Yep.
Did it just kind of emerge from that?
Yeah, so definitely yes, and I think there's an interesting caveat to that, which is when the project first got started, it was basically, okay, let's archive the data. Well, it's the raw JSON feed of just like events. It's an archive, and then to analyze it, you have to download it, process it in your own way, use whatever tools you're comfortable with, and then ask the questions, which frankly creates a barrier, right? So just the availability of the data certainly did lowers the barrier for a lot of people that wanted to ask those questions to go in and start playing with that data. And I worked with some of those people to help them kind of munch with the data. But that's where BigQuery came in. So BigQuery is, so let me backtrack. Google has a project called Dremel, and there's a really good paper on it, and Dremel was designed for our analysts at Google to query massive data sets interactively, right? So without requiring you to write code or learn a new language. We have DSLs like SQL, which a lot of analysts are familiar with, and that really lowers the barrier, right? If I tell you, go write some Java code to run a MapReduce, it's like, whoa, that's a big barrier. So Dremel was our way of solving that problem internally, and BigQuery was announced back in, I think, March of this year, is the productionized version available to the world. So we took the GitHub data, put it into BigQuery, and made it public, which means that anybody could log into BigQuery, and it's a public data set, and can just run a SQL query against it. So you don't have to worry about the fact that it's 150 gigabytes of data or whatnot. You just run a SQL, or you just write a SQL query, press run. All kinds of magic happens underneath. It could be MapReduce, it could be multiple steps, it could be anything, right? And that really brought down the bar. That's when we got starting. That's where we started getting really interesting insights. And I think it's a general trend that we're seeing at this event here, which is tools that allow you greater degrees of freedom in your ability to express and ask questions, right? So certainly you can ask any question you want if you write code.
Sure.
But you want to give higher level tools. Like I want to be able to query with almost like English language, right? And SQL is very good for that, right? So a lot of the queries that we showed today, backing some of the results, were frankly unremarkable SQL queries, right? In the sense that they would have multiple inner joins, subselects, aggregations, and all this kind of stuff that we're just familiar with, but we didn't have access to operate on a scale of even several hundred gigs of data. Right. But with a tool like BigQuery or Dremel, you can do that on within seconds, and that is that iterative ability to say, okay, I have this question. You get the results and you say, oh, interesting. That's not really what I was after. Let me try this variant, right? So that is really, really cool.
Interesting. So last question for you: is GitHub is that data an unusual data set, or are there others that are similar that you'd like to explore?
So it is unusual in a sense that GitHub is, I think, the open source hub today, and they provide, the reason I like the GitHub dataset is it's very metadata rich. So for example, they have 18 different activity types for things like an issue event, or a comment, or a commit push, or fork event, right? So there's a lot of rich information. But generally speaking, we also have, let's say, Wikipedia data in BigQuery, which is very interesting, right? Because now you can run interesting regressions and ask all those questions. So in general, I think the answer is absolutely yes, right? Any data set that is metadata rich, and this is the key point, I think. Oftentimes when you build a data warehouse, you build it for a specific purpose. Like you kind of know what you're after, and you select some subset of the data, or you build specific indexes. Whereas the premise of some of these newer tools, including BigQuery, is give us the full fidelity data, right? And we'll liberate you from the premise of having to work with your engineering team to build a specific index, right? Yes, you can literally run a regular expression against all the 5 terabytes of text, we're okay with that. That's
Yeah.
what the tool is designed for.
Right.
So that is exciting. So you can import we actually have Wikipedia in BigQuery, and it's very interesting to just kind of run ad hoc queries.
I
Like,
bet.
how many times
Sure.
is the word "the" mentioned, right? It's like, seems like a silly question. But once you look at the data, you'll be surprised.
I bet. I mean, that could be a real time waster, I imagine.
It is,
Yeah,
yes, absolutely.
yeah. Well, thanks so much for being with us. Appreciate you
Thank
taking
you.
the time.